The espresso machine hissed its familiar song as I pulled another perfect shot, the rich crema forming like velvet on top of the dark liquid beneath. 2 years of working at the Velvet Bean had turned these morning routines into second nature. The precise timing of steamed milk, the rhythmic dance between grinder and portafilter, the comfortable choreography of cafe life. Lena always joked that I moved behind the counter like a barista ballerina, each motion flowing seamlessly into the next. This small corner cafe had become more than just a job. It was my sanctuary, a place where the controlled chaos of coffee service provided a perfect escape from the unpredictable demands of university life. The Velvet Bean occupied a charming brick corner building where Maple Street met 3rd Avenue, its oversized windows creating a greenhouse effect that bathed everything in warm golden light during the morning hours. Mismatched vintage furniture gave the space an eclectic, lived-in feeling that regular customers had grown to love over the years. The exposed brick walls displayed local artwork that rotated monthly, and hanging plants cascaded from ceiling hooks, creating natural dividers between seating areas. I knew every creaky floorboard, every temperamental light switch, every corner where dust accumulated despite our daily cleaning routine. This was my territory, where I felt completely in control and utterly safe. My shifts typically followed the same predictable pattern: arrive at 6:30, start the industrial coffee brewers, arrange fresh pastries from our local bakery partner, and prepare for the 7 o'clock opening rush. The regulars would filter in with clockwork precision: Mr. Henderson with his double-shot cortado and newspaper, the grad students with their laptops and endless refills, the business commuters grabbing their fuel before catching the downtown train. Lena would usually appear around 8, ordering her signature lavender latte and claiming the corner table we'd designated as our unofficial headquarters since freshman year. These rhythms had become the backbone of my week, reliable anchors in an otherwise chaotic semester of finals, papers, and the constant stress of maintaining my scholarship GPA. The morning light streamed through our front windows with particular intensity, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors and illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the warm air. Everything felt perfectly aligned. The coffee beans were grinding with satisfying consistency, the milk steamer was behaving without its usual temperamental hissing, and even our notoriously finicky espresso machine seemed to be cooperating. I remember thinking how grateful I was for these peaceful moments before the real rush began, these quiet interludes where I could simply exist in the present moment. If someone had told me that this sense of tranquil routine would be shattered within the hour, I would have laughed and told them they were being overly dramatic. I had always believed the Velvet Bean was one of the safest spaces in our college town, a neutral ground where students, locals, and visitors could coexist peacefully over shared appreciation for quality coffee. The neighborhood surrounding us was well lit, frequently patrolled, and filled with other small businesses whose owners looked out for each other. Our customer base consisted largely of familiar faces, people I'd served hundreds of times, whose orders I knew by heart, whose personal dramas and triumphs I'd witnessed unfold over countless conversations. Violence and danger felt like abstract concepts that belonged to news reports and crime shows, not to our cozy corner of the world where the biggest crisis was usually running out of oat milk during the vegan rush. The familiar bell above our entrance chimed its cheerful greeting as the first wave of morning customers began trickling in, each person bringing their own small piece of the outside world into our carefully curated atmosphere. Steam rose from the espresso machine like incense, and the gentle buzz of conversation mixed with the soft jazz playlist I had carefully selected to enhance the cafe's ambiance. Lena texted that she was running 5 minutes late, which was practically early by her standards, and I found myself smiling as I prepared her usual lavender latte in advance. Every element of my morning was falling into place exactly as it should, creating that perfect sense of domestic harmony that I would soon learn to treasure as a memory. The grinding of coffee beans created a meditative white noise that had become the soundtrack to my thoughts, drowning out the small anxieties about upcoming exams and the perpetual worry about making ends meet on a barista's wages. I was completely absorbed in the familiar ritual of tamping grounds and adjusting the machine's pressure, when something in my peripheral vision seemed slightly off-kilter. It was such a subtle shift in the atmosphere that I almost dismissed it entirely, the way you might ignore a shadow that moves just slightly wrong in your peripheral vision. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted that first instinct, that initial whisper of intuition that something wasn't quite right in my perfectly ordered world.
The first sign that something unusual was happening came not as a dramatic revelation, but as a gentle tug at the edge of my consciousness. The way a familiar song played in a different key might sound almost right, but leave you feeling vaguely unsettled. A couple had entered with a small girl, maybe 8 years old, and while families weren't uncommon in our cafe, something about their dynamic felt subtly wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. The man kept his hand firmly on the child's shoulder, not in a protective way, but with the kind of controlling grip that suggested ownership rather than care. The woman seemed nervous, constantly glancing around as if checking for observers, and the little girl herself stood with an unnatural stillness that reminded me uncomfortably of a frightened animal trying to become invisible. My years of customer service had taught me to read people quickly, to distinguish between the caffeine-deprived irritability of morning commuters and genuine distress, between excited chatter and forced conversation. This family's interaction patterns felt scripted and artificial, like actors who hadn't quite memorized their lines yet. The man ordered for all three of them without consulting the others, his voice carrying an undertone of authority that seemed disproportionate to the simple act of ordering coffee. When I asked the little girl if she wanted whipped cream on her hot chocolate, the woman quickly interjected that children shouldn't have too much sugar, while the man's grip on the girl's shoulder visibly tightened. As I prepared their drinks, I found myself studying their reflection in the espresso machine's polished surface, trying to understand what exactly was triggering my growing sense of unease. The little girl never spoke, never made eye contact, never exhibited any of the natural curiosity or restlessness I'd come to expect from children her age. Her clothes were clean and appropriate, but something about the way she held herself, shoulders hunched, head down, arms crossed protectively across her body, suggested a level of hypervigilance that no 8-year-old should possess. The adults flanking her seemed to be performing the role of caring guardians rather than actually being them, and their constant awareness of her position reminded me more of guards than parents. The turning point came when the man stepped outside to take a phone call, and the woman excused herself to use the restroom, leaving the little girl alone at their corner table for what they probably assumed would be just a few minutes. In that moment of unexpected privacy, the child's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, and I saw her glance toward the front door with an expression of desperate longing that my heart clenched. She looked like a caged bird who had just glimpsed an open window. And when our eyes met across the cafe, the fear and pleading I saw there was so raw and immediate that every protective instinct I possessed suddenly roared to life. Without really planning it, I found myself walking over to her table with a plate of our complimentary cookies, using the pretense of customer service to get close enough for a quiet conversation. Up close, I could see faint bruising around her wrists that the long sleeves of her sweater had been carefully positioned to conceal, and the way she flinched when I approached told me everything I needed to know about her current situation. When I asked if she was okay, she looked toward the restroom door with obvious terror before whispering so quietly I almost missed it, "They're not my parents, and they won't let me go home." Those 9 words transformed my comfortable morning routine into the most important conversation of my life. And I realized that whatever happened next would define not just her future, but the kind of person I was willing to become. The weight of her confession hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the familiar safety of my cafe environment suddenly become charged with dangerous possibility. Every instinct screamed that I was in over my head, that this was a situation for police and social workers and people trained to handle kidnapping cases, not for college students who just wanted to serve coffee and pass their finals. But looking at this little girl's face, seeing the desperate hope mixed with terror in her eyes, I knew that the next few minutes might be her only chance for rescue. The man outside was finishing his phone call. The woman would return from the restroom any moment, and soon they would disappear with her into whatever nightmare they had planned.
The coffee was still brewing when I noticed something was different about Holly. We'd been working together at Richmond Literary Press for almost 3 years, and I knew her habits better than my own. She was always the first one at the office, her desk organized with the precision of someone who found comfort in routine, her morning ritual unchanged since the day I started. But lately she seemed distracted, constantly glancing toward the editorial department's back corner, where our newest hire, Daniel Price, had set up his workspace just 2 weeks prior. Our small publishing house had always felt like family. The converted Victorian building housed only 12 employees, spread across 2 floors, and we all knew each other's coffee preferences, weekend plans, and work quirks. Holly's desk sat directly across from mine in the main editorial room, surrounded by towering bookshelves and large windows that let in streams of natural light. We'd developed an easy friendship built on shared literary tastes, inside jokes about difficult authors, and the comfortable silence that comes from spending 40 hours a week in close proximity with someone who truly gets your work rhythm. The familiar comfort of our workplace had always been one of its greatest assets. Richmond Literary Press occupied a converted Victorian mansion in the city's historic district, complete with original hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places and windows tall enough to frame the changing seasons. Each room had its own character, from the sun-drenched front office where Holly and I worked, to the cozy break room with its mismatched furniture and walls lined with books from authors we'd published over the years. Everyone knew everyone else's coffee preferences, weekend plans, and the subtle signs that indicated when someone needed space to concentrate on a difficult manuscript. Daniel had been hired to help with our expanding workload, particularly the influx of horror and thriller submissions that had been flooding our inbox since our last bestseller. His resume was impressive enough: previous experience at larger publishing houses in New York, glowing recommendations, and a portfolio that demonstrated real editorial insight. During the interview process, he'd seemed quiet but competent, the kind of focused professional who would fit seamlessly into our small team. Our managing editor, Sarah, had been particularly pleased to find someone with his qualifications willing to work for what we could afford to pay. The first week had passed without incident, and Daniel appeared to be settling in well. He kept to himself mostly, arriving punctually each morning and leaving exactly at closing time, his workspace maintained with an almost military precision that put even Holly's organizational skills to shame. He spoke little during staff meetings, but when he did contribute, his suggestions were thoughtful and well-reasoned, showing he'd clearly done his homework on our catalog and editorial standards. If anything, he seemed almost too perfect, the kind of employee that made the rest of us slightly self-conscious about our more casual approach to office culture. But gradually,
I began to notice small things that didn't quite fit. The way his eyes would linger on Holly when she passed his desk, tracking her movements with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to casual workplace awareness. How he always seemed to time his coffee breaks to coincide with hers, positioning himself where he could observe her interactions with other colleagues while maintaining the pretense of reviewing manuscripts. There was something calculated about his positioning in the office, always ensuring he had a clear line of sight to her workspace while remaining just far enough away to avoid drawing attention to his behavior. Most unsettling was his smile, a fixed porcelain expression that never quite reached his eyes, appearing at odd moments when he thought no one was watching. I'd catch glimpses of it when Holly laughed at something another coworker said, or when she left for lunch with friends from the office. It wasn't the natural smile of someone enjoying a pleasant work environment, but something more artificial, more practiced, as if he'd rehearsed the appropriate facial expression for workplace interactions without truly understanding the emotions behind them. The smile made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't initially articulate, like seeing a photograph where something was slightly off-center but you couldn't quite identify what. The first concrete sign that something was wrong came during what should have been an ordinary lunch break. Holly had gone to the kitchen to heat up her usual salad when she called out to me from across the office, her voice carrying a note of confusion that made me look up from my editing. She was standing by her desk, holding a small white envelope that hadn't been there when she'd left for lunch 15 minutes earlier. The envelope bore her name written in precise, almost mechanical handwriting, with no return address or indication of who had placed it there, while the office was empty except for Daniel, who had remained at his desk working through his lunch as he always did.
Inside the envelope was a single sheet of cream-colored paper with a brief typed message. "Your dedication to literature inspires me more than you could know. I hope we can discuss our shared passion for storytelling soon." There was no signature, no identifying marks, nothing to indicate who had written it, except for the formal, almost archaic language that seemed oddly familiar yet impossible to place. Holly looked genuinely puzzled as she showed me the note, wondering aloud if it might be from one of the authors we'd been corresponding with, though she couldn't recall anyone who wrote in such a stilted, overly formal style. We both agreed it was probably nothing serious, perhaps a shy admirer from another department, or even a mistake that had been delivered to the wrong person. The second note arrived 3 days later, this time placed directly on Holly's keyboard, where she couldn't possibly miss it when she returned from a client meeting. The message was longer this time, more personal in tone. "I've been watching how you work with such grace and intelligence. Your insights during yesterday's editorial meeting were particularly illuminating. I believe we have more in common than you realize, and I would very much like the opportunity to share some of my own work with someone who would truly understand its deeper meanings." Again, no signature, but the same mechanical handwriting and formal language that felt increasingly out of place in our casual workplace environment. Holly's confusion was beginning to shift toward genuine concern, and she mentioned the notes to Sarah during their weekly one-on-one meeting. Sarah promised to look into it, suggesting that perhaps someone from another floor was using our office as a shortcut and had mistaken Holly for someone else. She assured Holly that she'd send an email to all staff reminding everyone about appropriate workplace communication and the importance of signing any written correspondence. It seemed like a reasonable response to what still appeared to be a minor workplace mystery, though I noticed Holly had started glancing around the office more frequently, as if trying to identify potential note writers among our small staff.
The third note was different in a way that made my skin crawl. Rather than being placed on Holly's desk or keyboard, it was slipped under her car windshield wiper in the parking lot behind our building, a space that wasn't visible from most office windows and required someone to either follow her outside or wait and watch for her departure time. The message itself had evolved from admiration to something more possessive. "I've noticed you leave work at different times depending on your workload. Your dedication is admirable, but I worry about you walking to your car alone after dark. Perhaps I could offer to escort you to ensure your safety. There are many dangers that a trusting person like yourself might not recognize until it's too late." The shift from workplace admirer to someone who is actively monitoring Holly's schedule and movements represented a clear escalation that we could no longer dismiss as harmless. Holly showed the note to Sarah immediately, and Sarah called an emergency staff meeting to address what she termed inappropriate communication between team members. She emphasized that all workplace interactions should be professional and transparent, and that anonymous notes were not acceptable under any circumstances. During the meeting, I watched Daniel carefully, looking for any reaction that might give away his involvement, but his expression remained perfectly neutral, that same porcelain smile fixed in place as he nodded along with Sarah's directives. After the meeting, Daniel approached Holly directly for the first time since he'd started working with us. His manner was polite, almost deferential, as he expressed concern about the harassment she'd been experiencing and offered his assistance in identifying the perpetrator. He suggested that, as someone new to the office, he might notice things that others had become accustomed to overlooking, and he volunteered to keep an eye out for any suspicious behavior from visitors or delivery personnel who might have access to the building. Holly thanked him for his concern, though I noticed she kept the conversation brief and positioned herself where other colleagues could overhear their entire exchange. The next escalation came in the form of a small gift left on Holly's desk, a delicate porcelain figurine of a clown with an eerily human-like face and an expression that mirrored Daniel's fixed smile. The figurine was expensive-looking, clearly handcrafted, and came with a note explaining that it was a small token of appreciation for someone who brings joy to others through her work, just as this little clown is meant to bring joy through his permanent smile. The clown's painted eyes seemed to follow you as you moved around it, and there was something deeply unsettling about its presence in our bright, book-filled office space.
Holly immediately brought the figurine to Sarah, who decided it was time to involve building security and potentially the police. The gift represented a clear boundary violation. Someone was spending considerable money on Holly and had access to her personal workspace during business hours. Security reviewed the building's limited camera footage but found nothing conclusive, as the cameras didn't cover individual desk areas and there were several blind spots where someone could move undetected. The police officer who responded treated it as a low-priority case, taking notes and photographs, but explaining that no actual crime had been committed and they could only escalate their involvement if the situation became more threatening. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to offer his help and support, positioning himself as an ally in identifying Holly's anonymous stalker. He suggested that perhaps the perpetrator was someone from outside the company who had gained access to our building during business hours when visitors were common. He volunteered to document any unusual behavior he observed and even offered to vary his own lunch schedule to provide better coverage of the office during times when Holly might be vulnerable. His concerns seemed genuine, his suggestions logical, and his willingness to help beyond what would be expected from a new employee appeared to demonstrate good character and team loyalty.
But I was beginning to notice patterns that made me increasingly uncomfortable with Daniel's behavior. He always seemed to know exactly when Holly would be returning from lunch, arriving back at his desk moments before she walked through the door. He had memorized her schedule with precision that went far beyond normal workplace awareness, commenting casually on meetings she had mentioned only in passing, or asking about projects he shouldn't have known she was working on. His questions were always framed as helpful professional interest, but the depth of his knowledge about her daily routine suggested he was paying far more attention to her activities than was appropriate or necessary. The situation escalated dramatically when Holly discovered that someone had been taking photographs of her apartment building. The images were printed on professional quality photo paper and left in an envelope marked "For Your Safety," tucked under her apartment door. The photographs showed her building from multiple angles, her car in its assigned parking space, and even shots of her apartment windows taken from positions that would have required the photographer to trespass on private property. Attached was a note warning her that her building's security was inadequate and that someone who cared about her well-being felt compelled to document these vulnerabilities so she could take appropriate precautions. Holly was now genuinely frightened, and she filed a formal police report about the stalking behavior. The officer assigned to her case took the situation more seriously, given the escalation to photographing her residence, but explained that their options remained limited. He advised her to vary her routes home from work, consider staying with friends temporarily, and document any further contact attempts. Holly asked Sarah about the possibility of working from home for a while, but our small company's collaborative editorial process made remote work impractical for more than a day or two at a time. During this period, Daniel's behavior became even more solicitous and protective. He expressed outrage about Holly's stalker situation and volunteered to walk her to her car after work, pointing out that there was safety in numbers, and that as a newer employee, he often stayed late anyway to catch up on his workload. He suggested that perhaps other male colleagues could also take turns providing escort services until the police identified and arrested the perpetrator. His anger about Holly's situation seemed genuine and appropriate, and his protective instincts appeared to come from a place of genuine concern for a colleague's safety. Yet, something about Daniel's responses felt performative rather than authentic. His expressions of concern were perfectly calibrated, his suggestions logical, but somehow calculated, and his timing always impeccable in ways that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. I began to suspect that Daniel might be involved in Holly's harassment, but I had no evidence beyond a growing sense of unease about his behavior patterns and an intuitive feeling that his helpfulness was too perfectly orchestrated to be natural. My suspicions were confirmed when I decided to stay late one evening to catch up on manuscript reviews. Most of the office had emptied out by 6 o'clock, and I thought I was alone when I heard Daniel's voice coming from the direction of Holly's desk. He was speaking in low tones to someone, his words too quiet for me to make out clearly, but there was an intimacy to his voice that was completely at odds with his usual formal workplace demeanor. When I quietly moved closer to investigate, I discovered he was talking to the porcelain clown figurine, which he had repositioned to face toward where Holly normally sat.
"She's starting to understand how much she means to me," he was saying to the figurine, his voice carrying a possessive tone that made my blood run cold. "Soon she'll realize that all of this attention is because someone finally sees her true value, someone who appreciates her in ways those other people never could. She just needs to stop being afraid and start being grateful for having someone who cares enough to protect her from all the dangers she doesn't even see coming." He was stroking the figurine's painted face as he spoke, and his expression had shifted from his usual porcelain smile to something more genuine and infinitely more disturbing.
I remained hidden behind the bookshelf, documenting everything with my phone's voice recorder, as Daniel continued his one-sided conversation with increasing intensity. He spoke about Holly's daily routines with intimate knowledge that could only have come from extensive surveillance, mentioning details about her weekend activities, her grocery shopping habits, and even her exercise schedule that she had never shared with anyone at work. He described following her home multiple times, learning her patterns, and planning ways to accidentally encounter her outside of work so they could develop a more personal relationship away from the constraints of professional boundaries. Most chilling was his discussion of the photographs he had taken, which extended far beyond the building security shots he had left at her apartment. He had been systematically documenting Holly's life for weeks, creating what he called a comprehensive portrait of the real Holly that captured her natural beauty and unconscious grace in private moments when she believed herself to be unobserved. He spoke about these images with the reverence of an art collector describing prized acquisitions, and he mentioned having prints made at multiple locations to avoid arousing suspicion at any single photo lab. When Daniel finally finished his disturbing monologue and prepared to leave, I remained hidden until I heard the building's main door close behind him. Then I immediately called Holly to warn her about what I had discovered, followed by calls to both the police and building security. The recording I had made provided the evidence needed to connect Daniel definitively to Holly's harassment, and officers were dispatched to locate him before he could return to his apartment and potentially destroy additional evidence of his stalking activities. Daniel was arrested at his residence, where police discovered an extensive collection of photographs, personal items stolen from Holly's desk and car, and detailed journals documenting his obsession with her daily activities. His apartment was decorated with enlarged photographs of Holly taken without her knowledge, arranged in a shrine-like display around the room. Multiple porcelain clown figurines, identical to the one he had given her, were positioned throughout the space, all facing toward the photographs as if they were an audience watching her every move. The journals revealed that his obsession had begun during his first day at work, triggered by what he perceived as Holly's kindness in showing him around the office and explaining our editorial procedures. The police investigation revealed that Daniel had lied extensively on his job application, using fabricated references and work history to gain employment at our company. His previous jobs had ended due to similar harassment issues, but he had managed to conceal this pattern by frequently changing cities and using different variations of his name on applications. He had specifically targeted small family-like workplaces where he believed he could develop intimate relationships with female colleagues without the oversight and formal procedures that might exist at larger corporations. Holly obtained a restraining order against Daniel, who was ultimately sentenced to jail time for stalking, harassment, and criminal trespass. Our company implemented new security measures, including background checks that went beyond standard employment verification and security cameras that covered all workspace areas. Sarah hired a security consultant to review our building access procedures and staff safety protocols, acknowledging that our small, trusting work environment had made it too easy for a predator to infiltrate and exploit our informal workplace culture.
Even months later, Holly would occasionally mention feeling like she was being watched, though there was no evidence that Daniel had violated his restraining order or made any attempts to contact her from prison. She had developed a heightened awareness of men who paid too much attention to her daily habits, and she struggled with trusting new colleagues or allowing casual workplace friendships to develop naturally. The experience had taught her that predators could appear completely normal and even helpful while systematically violating her privacy and safety in ways she hadn't even realized were happening. Today, over a year later, Holly still keeps the porcelain clown figurine locked in her desk drawer, unable to throw it away, but unable to look at its fixed smile without remembering the months when her workplace sanctuary became a hunting ground. She says it reminds her to trust her instincts when something feels wrong, even when that something appears perfectly reasonable on the surface. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who position themselves as protectors, offering help while simultaneously creating the very dangers they claim to be guarding against.
I'd been living alone in my one-bedroom apartment on Maple Street for almost 3 years, and my routine had become as predictable as clockwork. Work at the warehouse from 6 to 4, dinner from whatever I could microwave, maybe a beer while watching whatever was on cable, and bed by 10:30 so I could do it all again the next day. My life wasn't exciting, but it was stable, comfortable, and completely under my control. The apartment wasn't much to look at. Beige walls, secondhand furniture, and windows that faced the parking lot instead of anything scenic, but it was mine, paid for with honest work, and it represented everything I'd built for myself since high school and did in real life began. My friendship with Noah went back to when we were 16, inseparable through our final years of high school when we'd spend entire weekends at each other's houses, planning futures that seemed limitless and achievable. We'd been through everything together. Failed driving tests, first heartbreaks, graduation ceremonies where we promised we'd stay close no matter where life took us. But as often happens when childhood ends and adult responsibilities take over, our paths had diverged significantly over the past few years. While I'd chosen stability and steady employment, Noah had always been drawn to shortcuts and quick schemes, chasing opportunities that promised easy money but usually delivered complications instead. The warehouse job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough to cover my rent, utilities, and grocery bills, with a little left over for the occasional night out or small luxury. My days followed the same comfortable pattern: alarm at 5:15, coffee and toast, 20-minute drive through familiar streets to the loading docks where I'd spend 8 hours moving boxes and pallets with the same group of reliable coworkers I'd known for years. After work, I'd stop at the same grocery store, buy ingredients for simple meals, and return home to my quiet apartment where I could decompress from the physical demands of the day. It was a simple life, perhaps boring to some people, but it gave me a sense of security and purpose that I'd never taken for granted. The neighborhood around my apartment complex was decent, not upscale, but safe enough that I could walk to the corner store after dark without worrying about my safety. Tree-lined streets with modest houses, working families who kept their yards maintained and their music at reasonable volumes, the kind of place where people nodded hello when they passed on the sidewalk. My building was a small complex of 8 units, occupied mostly by other young professionals and older folks on fixed incomes, all of us sharing an unspoken agreement to respect each other's privacy and space. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my upstairs neighbor's television sometimes, but thick enough that I felt completely private when I wanted to be alone with my thoughts. I'd always prided myself on being the kind of friend people could count on in emergencies, the reliable one who'd drop everything to help when called upon. Throughout our teenage years, I'd been the designated driver, the one who'd cover for friends when they made mistakes, the person parents trusted because I seemed mature and responsible beyond my years. That reputation had followed me into adulthood, and I wore it like a badge of honor, believing that loyalty and dependability were among the most important qualities a person could possess. When friends needed rides, loans, or just someone to listen to their problems, they knew they could call me at any hour, and I'd find a way to help, no questions asked and no judgment passed. My evenings were usually spent in the living room, settled into the worn but comfortable recliner I'd bought from a thrift store, remote control in hand, and a cold beer within easy reach. The apartment's layout was simple and functional. Living room connected to a small kitchen, one bedroom barely large enough for my double bed and dresser, and a bathroom with a shower that had decent water pressure when the building's plumbing was cooperating. I knew every creak and settling noise the place made, every shadow that moved across the walls when cars passed outside, every sound that carried from the other units or the street below. It was my sanctuary, the place where I could let my guard down completely and just exist without having to perform or impress anyone. The building's security wasn't anything special: a front door that locked automatically,
and individual deadbolts on each apartment door. But I'd never felt unsafe or concerned about intruders. The parking lot was well lit, the other tenants seemed trustworthy, and the surrounding neighborhood had a low crime rate according to the statistics I'd researched before signing my lease. I kept my keys on a hook by the door, left my curtains open during the day to let in natural light, and never thought twice about the vulnerability that comes with ground floor living. My sense of security was complete and unquestioned, built on years of incident-free residence and the comfortable assumption that bad things happen to other people in other places.
That particular evening had been exactly like hundreds of others. I'd come home from work, physically tired but mentally relaxed, heated up leftover pizza, and settled in to watch a mindless action movie while my muscles gradually unknotted from the day's labor. The apartment felt especially cozy with the autumn air turning cooler outside, and the warm light from my lamps creating a bubble of comfort against the growing darkness beyond my windows. I remember thinking how perfectly content I felt in that moment, surrounded by my modest possessions in my small but adequate space, with nowhere I needed to be and nothing urgent demanding my attention until the next morning's alarm would start the cycle all over again. The first sign that something was different came around 11:30, when I was already thinking about heading to bed and getting a solid night's sleep before another day at the warehouse. I noticed a car idling in the parking lot with its headlights off, which wasn't entirely unusual, since residents sometimes sat in their cars to finish phone calls or smoke cigarettes before going inside. But something about this particular vehicle caught my attention. Maybe the way it was positioned to have a clear view of my apartment, or maybe just an instinct that the occupant was focused on my building rather than simply taking a break. I glanced out casually while getting up to throw away my empty beer bottle, noting the car's general shape and location without giving it much serious thought. My initial reaction was completely logical and dismissive, probably someone waiting to pick up a friend, or maybe a new resident familiarizing themselves with the parking situation before attempting to maneuver into one of the tighter spaces. The complex attracted young professionals who often worked late shifts or had active social lives that kept them out until all hours, so unusual parking patterns weren't uncommon or concerning. I continued with my normal end-of-evening routine, rinsing my dinner dishes and putting them in the small dishwasher, checking that my work clothes were ready for the next day, setting my phone to charge on the nightstand. The car outside never crossed my mind again as I went through these familiar motions of winding down from another ordinary day. But about 20 minutes later, when I was brushing my teeth and getting ready for bed, I happened to glance out the bathroom window and noticed the same car was still there, still positioned with that clear view of my side of the building. This time, I paid closer attention, trying to make out details through the darkness in my window's reflection, but the distance and lighting made it impossible to see inside the vehicle or even determine its exact make and model. A small knot of curiosity formed in my stomach, not quite concern, but definitely heightened awareness that something about the situation was slightly off from the normal patterns I'd observed during my years of living there. Still, I convinced myself it was probably nothing worth worrying about. Over the next hour, as I moved through my apartment turning off lights and preparing for sleep, I found myself occasionally peeking out different windows to check if the mysterious car was still there. Each time I looked, it remained in the same position, and each time I tried to convince myself there was a perfectly innocent explanation for its presence that had nothing to do with me or my daily activities. Maybe someone was having relationship problems and needed space to think, or maybe a delivery driver was taking a break between late-night runs, or maybe I was just imagining patterns where none existed. But the longer the car remained stationary, the more difficult it became to ignore the growing sensation that something unusual was developing in my normally predictable environment. By midnight, when I was lying in bed but finding it difficult to fall asleep, I realized I'd been unconsciously listening for sounds that might indicate the car's departure. An engine starting, doors slamming, tires moving across the parking lot's asphalt surface. Instead, there was only the usual nighttime quiet of the complex, broken occasionally by distant traffic on the main road, or the settling noises of the building itself. The absence of any resolution to the car situation had planted a seed of unease that made relaxation impossible, and I found myself staring at the ceiling while my mind ran through increasingly elaborate explanations for what I had observed. Sleep finally came sometime after 1 a.m., fitful and interrupted by dreams I couldn't quite remember upon waking. The next morning brought gray skies and the promise of rain, and when I looked out at the parking lot while getting ready for work, the mysterious car was gone without a trace.
In the harsh light of day, surrounded by the familiar routine of coffee and breakfast in preparation for another shift at the warehouse, the previous night's concerns seemed almost embarrassingly overblown. Cars came and went at the complex at all hours for perfectly legitimate reasons, and I'd allowed my imagination to transform a completely normal occurrence into something sinister and threatening. I laughed at myself while locking my apartment door, chalking the whole episode up to too many crime shows and not enough real problems to occupy my mind with genuine concerns.
But during my lunch break at work, while sitting in the break room with my usual sandwich and chips, I found myself thinking about the car again, despite my morning's rational dismissal of any cause for concern. There had been something about its positioning that seemed deliberately observational. Something about the length of time it had remained stationary that went beyond casual or coincidental presence in the area. I tried to remember if I'd seen the same vehicle in the neighborhood before, during my daily commutes or weekend errands, but nothing specific came to mind among the countless cars that passed through my awareness on any given day. The uncertainty bothered me more than I wanted to admit, like an itch I couldn't reach or a word on the tip of my tongue that wouldn't come. When I returned home from work that evening, I made a point of scanning the parking lot more carefully than usual, noting the positions and details of the vehicles I recognized as belonging to my neighbors. Everything appeared normal and familiar. The same handful of cars in their usual spaces, no unfamiliar vehicles lurking in corners or positioned for surveillance purposes. I felt relieved and slightly foolish for having given the previous night's incident so much mental energy, and I settled into my evening routine with renewed confidence that my peaceful existence would continue undisturbed. The apartment felt especially welcoming after my day of physical labor, and I looked forward to another quiet night of television and relaxation in my comfortable sanctuary. Around 10 p.m., while I was halfway through a documentary about deep-sea exploration, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the grass outside my bedroom window. The sound was subtle but distinct from the usual nighttime noises of the complex, not the sharp click of heels on pavement or the shuffle of someone walking to their car, but the softer, more deliberate sound of someone trying to move quietly across the landscaped area between buildings. I muted the television and listened more carefully, but the sound had stopped, leaving only the ambient hum of air conditioning units and distant traffic. My heart rate had increased noticeably, and I realized how much the previous night's car incident had affected my baseline level of alertness and suspicion. I moved to the bedroom window and carefully lifted one corner of the curtain to peer outside, but the landscaped area was poorly lit and filled with shadows cast by decorative shrubs and small trees that the complex's management had planted to create a more attractive environment. Nothing moved in my field of vision, and after several minutes of watching, I convinced myself that the sound had probably been a cat or some other small animal moving through the vegetation in search of food or shelter. Urban wildlife was common in our area, and I had occasionally seen raccoons, opossums, and stray cats navigating the spaces between buildings during my late-night returns from errands or social obligations. But as I returned to the living room and attempted to resume watching my documentary, I found my attention divided between the narrator's descriptions of bizarre deep-sea creatures and my heightened awareness of every small sound from outside my apartment. The building's normal settling noises seemed amplified and potentially significant. Every car passing on the street required a moment of assessment to determine if it was slowing down or maintaining normal speed, and I caught myself periodically glancing toward the windows, even though the curtains blocked any view of potential activity in the parking lot or surrounding areas. The third night brought the most unsettling incident yet, when I was awakened around 2 a.m. by what sounded unmistakably like someone testing the lock on my front door. The sound was careful and deliberate, not the fumbling of a drunk neighbor trying to get into the wrong apartment, but the methodical manipulation of someone trying to determine if the door was secure without making enough noise to wake the occupant inside. I lay perfectly still in my bed, heart
hammering against my ribs, straining to hear any additional sounds that might confirm or deny what I thought I had experienced. The silence that followed was almost worse than the original sound, pregnant with possibilities and implications that made sleep impossible for the remainder of the night. In the morning, I carefully examined my front door and the immediate area around it, looking for any signs of tampering or attempted entry. The lock appeared normal and undamaged. The door frame showed no scratches or tool marks, and there were no obvious footprints or other evidence in the hallway carpeting that might indicate someone had spent time outside my apartment during the night. But I couldn't shake the certainty that what I had heard was real and intentional, not the product of dreams or imagination or the building's normal nocturnal sounds. The violation, I felt, was profound and disorienting. Someone had invaded the security of my home environment without actually gaining entry, leaving me feeling exposed and vulnerable in a space that had always represented complete safety.
That afternoon, I made my first concrete decision to take protective action by visiting a hardware store and purchasing additional security measures for my apartment. I bought a door security bar, motion-activated lights for the windows, and a small security camera that could be positioned to monitor the front entrance. The salesperson was helpful and understanding, mentioning that many residents in the area had been upgrading their home security recently due to increased reports of prowling and attempted break-ins. This information was both reassuring in that it suggested my experiences weren't unique or paranoid, and deeply concerning in that it confirmed the existence of actual threats in my previously peaceful neighborhood. Installing the new security measures gave me a sense of taking control over my situation and actively protecting myself, rather than simply waiting to see what might happen next. The door security bar was simple but effective, creating a physical barrier that would make forced entry significantly more difficult, even if someone managed to defeat the standard lock. The motion-activated lights would eliminate the advantage of darkness that any potential intruder might be counting on, automatically illuminating the area around my windows if anyone approached too closely. The security camera, though small and basic, would at least provide some record of any suspicious activity that I might not witness directly. But even with these new protections in place, I found that my daily routine had been fundamentally altered by the growing awareness that I was being watched or targeted by someone with unknown intentions. I began varying my schedule whenever possible, leaving for work at slightly different times and taking different routes home to avoid establishing predictable patterns that could be exploited by someone planning an attack or intrusion. My previously casual attitude toward personal security had been replaced by constant vigilance and strategic thinking about potential threats and vulnerabilities that I'd never considered during my years of comfortable, undisturbed living in the complex. The phone call that would change everything came at 3:47 a.m. on a night when I'd finally managed to fall into deep sleep despite my ongoing security concerns. Noah's name flashed on my cracked screen, and even in my groggy state, I recognized that something was catastrophically wrong based on the late hour and the desperation immediately apparent in his voice. We hadn't spoken in several months due to his increasingly erratic behavior and involvement with people I didn't trust, but our friendship went back so many years that his call automatically triggered my protective instincts, despite any reservations I might have had about getting involved in his latest crisis. The timing felt significant and ominous, coming just as my own sense of security had been systematically undermined by the recent incidents around my apartment. "Danny, I need you." His voice cracked through the speaker, barely above a whisper, but trembling with an urgency that made my blood run cold and immediately focused my attention despite the disorientation of being awakened from deep sleep. "I'm at the old rail yard on Meridian Street, and I can't explain over the phone, but I'm in deep trouble. Real deep." The background noise was strange and unsettling. Distant metal clanging like freight cars settling in the night, mixed with what sounded like his ragged, panicked breathing and possibly other sounds I couldn't identify through the phone's limited audio quality.
Please, man, you're the only person I can trust right now." The desperation in his voice cut through any hesitation I might have had about venturing into that sketchy part of town in the middle of the night, especially given my recent experiences with feeling watched and potentially targeted by someone with unknown intentions. I threw on clothes without thinking clearly about the implications or dangers of what I was agreeing to do, grabbed my keys from their hook by the door, and was backing out of my driveway within minutes while my mind raced through possibilities of what kind of trouble Noah had gotten himself into this time. The rail yard was a 20-minute drive through increasingly deteriorating neighborhoods, past closed storefronts with barred windows, abandoned lots grown up with weeds, and streetlights that flickered unreliably in the pre-dawn darkness. As I navigated the empty streets, following a route I'd driven only a few times before and relying on my phone's GPS to guide me through the unfamiliar territory, I couldn't shake the feeling that this call was different from Noah's usual requests for rides home from bars or small loans to cover rent until his next payday. The abandoned rail yard stretched for acres along the industrial district, a graveyard of rusted freight cars and overgrown tracks that hadn't seen regular commercial service in over a decade due to changes in shipping routes and economic priorities. Chain-link fencing surrounded most of the perimeter, topped with coils of razor wire and posted with warnings about trespassing and prosecution. But I knew, from our teenage explorations and urban adventures, that there were plenty of gaps where desperate or determined people could slip through undetected.
The place had always given me the creeps, even in daylight when we'd occasionally ventured there out of curiosity or boredom. Too many shadows between the train cars, too many places for dangerous people to hide illegal activities, too many local legends about bodies being found among the weeds and scrap metal by maintenance workers or homeless individuals seeking shelter. Now, in the dead of night, with fog rolling in from the nearby river and obscuring the already limited visibility, the rail yard looked like the setting for every urban nightmare I'd ever imagined were seen depicted in crime movies. My headlights cut through the mist and darkness, illuminating sections of rusted metal and overgrown vegetation that seemed to shift and move in ways that suggested hidden dangers lurking just beyond the reach of artificial illumination. The silence was oppressive and unnatural, broken only by the distant sounds of the city's late-night activity and the occasional metallic groan of old train cars settling under temperature changes. I felt completely exposed and vulnerable as I parked near what I hoped was the main entrance and tried to figure out how to locate Noah among acres of industrial decay and potential hiding places. I found Noah huddled behind a derailed cargo car about 50 yards from where I'd entered the complex, and the sight of him shocked me more than his panicked phone call had prepared me for. His usually pristine appearance was completely destroyed. Designer clothes torn and stained with substances I didn't want to identify, face streaked with dirt and what looked suspiciously like dried blood, hands shaking so violently he could barely manipulate the cigarette he was attempting to light between his teeth. But what really caught my attention and triggered a new level of concern was the black backpack clutched against his chest with desperate intensity, bulging with unknown contents and marked with dark stains that looked fresh and wet in the harsh beam of my flashlight. When he saw me approaching through the maze of abandoned rail equipment, his eyes filled with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Thank God you came," he whispered in a voice that was barely audible above the ambient sounds of the night, stumbling to his feet with obvious difficulty and immediately wincing as if every movement caused significant physical pain. "We have to get out of here right now. They'll be looking for me, and if they find us both here..." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought, but his implication hung heavy in the cold night air like a threat that had already been spoken aloud. The backpack never left his desperate grip, even as he struggled to maintain his balance and coordinate his movements, and I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder every few seconds as if expecting pursuit from multiple directions. "I'll explain everything once we're somewhere safe, but right now we just need to disappear before they figure out where I went." His desperation was contagious and overwhelming, And despite every rational instinct telling me to demand answers and explanations before getting further involved, I found myself automatically moving to help him toward my car. The drive back to my apartment was tense and silent, except for Noah's occasional sharp intakes of breath and muttered curses that seemed directed at himself rather than our current situation. He kept that mysterious, blood-stained backpack clutched on his lap with both arms wrapped around it protectively, treating it like it contained either something precious beyond measure or something dangerous beyond imagination. Through the rearview mirror, I found myself checking constantly for following headlights or vehicles that seemed to be maintaining the same speed and direction as us, infected by his paranoia even though I had no clear understanding of what we were supposedly running from or who might be pursuing us. The rational part of my mind was screaming that I should take him to a hospital or a police station, or at least demand some basic explanation of what had happened to put him in this obviously injured and terrified condition. But the loyalty built over years of close friendship, combined with the genuine terror radiating from him in waves, kept me focused solely on the immediate goal of getting him somewhere safe where we could assess the situation. Back at my apartment, Noah immediately went to work securing every possible entry point with an efficiency that suggested he'd done this before, double-checking the locks I'd recently upgraded, drawing all the curtains and blinds to block any view from outside, even jamming chairs under door handles like he'd seen in action movies or learned from personal experience with similar situations. The backpack finally left his hands long enough for him to complete these defensive preparations, but he kept it within arm's reach at all times throughout the process, and I noticed how his eyes would dart to its location whenever he thought I wasn't observing his behavior. When I offered him coffee and a chance to use my shower to clean up and treat whatever injuries he'd sustained, he accepted the coffee gratefully but refused the shower, claiming he needed to stay alert and ready to run at a moment's notice in case our location was discovered by his mysterious pursuers.
"They're connected people, Danny," he finally said after we'd been sitting in my living room for nearly an hour, speaking in deliberately vague terms that told me almost nothing concrete, but managed to terrify me completely through implication and tone. The kind who don't forgive mistakes and don't forget faces, especially when money goes missing or deals go wrong. He was staring out the window through a gap in the curtains, watching the parking lot with the intensity of a soldier scanning for enemy movement, and his entire body remained coiled with tension, despite being in what should have been a safe environment. I can't tell you everything, because the less you know, the safer you'll be if they start asking questions about who might have helped me. The backpack sat between us on the coffee table like a dark omen, its contents remaining mysterious but clearly central to whatever crisis had brought him to my door in the middle of the night. The first few days of hiding Noah in my apartment felt like the longest of my life, with both of us jumping at every creak of the building settling and every footstep in the hallway outside that might indicate unwanted visitors. He barely slept more than an hour or two at a time, instead spending most of his time pacing between my living room windows and peering through the blinds at the street below, muttering about cars that might be conducting surveillance and people who might have followed our trail from the rail yard to my address. The backpack remained unopened and unexplained despite my growing curiosity about its contents, and whenever I brought up the subject directly, Noah would immediately change the topic or claim it was better for my own safety if I didn't know the specific details of what I was helping him protect. Plausible deniability, he'd say, with a bitter laugh that contained no humor. If they catch up to us, you can honestly say you don't know what's in there or how deep this goes. His protectiveness regarding the backpack's contents only made my imagination run wilder with increasingly dark possibilities. Drugs, money, weapons, evidence of crimes I didn't want to contemplate, or combinations of illegal items that would explain both his terror and the apparent sophistication of whoever was pursuing him. I found myself studying his behavior for clues about the nature of our situation, noting how he'd unconsciously touch the bag whenever he was particularly stressed, how he'd position himself to keep it in his peripheral vision even when focused on other activities, how he'd grip it tightly whenever unexpected sounds came from outside the apartment. The weight of not knowing was almost worse than any specific knowledge might have been, because my mind filled the void with scenarios that ranged from merely criminal to genuinely life-threatening for both of us. By the 4th day of our confinement, the strain was showing on both of us in ways that made our situation feel increasingly unsustainable and dangerous. I'd called in sick to work so many consecutive days that I was probably going to lose my job, which could create financial problems that could force us out of our hiding place sooner than might be safe. Noah had developed several nervous tics, including an unconscious habit of touching the backpack every few minutes, as if reassuring himself it was still secure, and a tendency to freeze completely whenever he heard unfamiliar sounds from the building's other residents going about their normal daily activities. We were surviving on food delivery services and whatever canned and packaged supplies I had stored in my pantry, afraid to venture out for shopping or other necessities that might expose our location to whoever was searching for him. The walls of my small apartment, which had always felt cozy and protective, were starting to feel like a prison cell that was shrinking daily under the pressure of our shared anxiety and forced proximity. When Noah did attempt to explain what happened to put us in this situation, his stories were fragmented and contradictory, filled with references to people whose names meant nothing to me, and events that seemed to shift in importance and detail each time he recounted them. Something about a business deal that had gone sideways, money that belonged to dangerous individuals, and a situation that had escalated beyond anything he'd intended or imagined possible. The more he talked, providing pieces of information that didn't quite fit together into a coherent narrative, the more I realized how little I actually knew about what my oldest friend had been doing with his life during the months when we'd had minimal contact. The paranoia that had initially seemed like Noah's personal burden gradually infected my own thinking, transforming my previously secure apartment into a fortress under siege, where every delivery truck that lingered too long in the parking lot and every unfamiliar face in the building's common areas represented a potential threat to our safety. Noah had me convinced that his enemies were sophisticated enough to track us through credit card transactions, cell phone signals, and security camera footage, so we lived like fugitives in my own home, using cash for all purchases and avoiding any activities that might leave digital traces of our presence or movements.
He'd spend hours studying the layout of my apartment complex and the surrounding neighborhood, mapping out 3 different escape routes that would allow us to reach his car without being observed. And he'd made me practice these routes until I could navigate them in complete darkness without conscious thought. "They're patient," he'd tell me, during his more lucid moments, when the immediate panic subsided enough for him to speak in complete sentences about our strategic situation. "They'll wait for us to get comfortable, to make a mistake, to let our guard down long enough for them to move in and finish what they started." The weight of his fear was crushing and all-consuming, affecting every aspect of our daily existence and making it impossible for me to maintain any sense of normalcy or routine. I found myself scanning the faces of strangers during the rare occasions when I did venture out for essential supplies, looking for signs of recognition or interest that might indicate we'd been discovered, jumping at shadows and treating every coincidence as a potential sign that our enemies were closing in on our location. On the 7th morning, I woke up naturally without an alarm clock to complete silence, an absence of sound that immediately felt wrong and ominous after 6 days of Noah's constant restless movement and his habit of muttering to himself during his frequent periods of insomnia. The spot where he'd been sleeping on my couch was completely empty, the blanket folded neatly and precisely, as if he'd never been there at all. And most importantly and alarmingly, the mysterious backpack that had been his constant companion was nowhere to be seen in my apartment. There was no note of explanation or goodbye, no message on my phone, just the lingering smell of his cigarettes in the air and the impression his body had left in my couch cushions as the only evidence that the previous week of hiding and fear had actually happened. I searched every room of my small apartment twice,
looking in closets and cabinets and under furniture in case he was hiding, or had stashed the backpack somewhere for safekeeping, then checked the parking lot for his car and found that it too had vanished without a trace. I called his phone number, knowing it would go straight to voicemail, which it did, and left a message asking him to contact me and let me know he was safe, though I suspected he'd probably discarded that phone along with any other items that might be used to track his location. He had vanished as suddenly and completely as he'd appeared in that rail yard 7 nights earlier, leaving me with more questions than answers, and the terrible, growing suspicion that I'd been used as nothing more than a convenient temporary hideout while he planned his next move. The weeks that followed Noah's disappearance were a special kind of torture, filled with jumping at shadows and wondering if the people he'd claimed to fear were now looking for me as a potential source of information about his whereabouts or the contents of that mysterious backpack. Every knock on my door sent my heart racing with the possibility that dangerous individuals had tracked him to my apartment. Every unfamiliar car in my neighborhood made me change my route home from work and approach my building from different directions. Every news report about drug busts or gang violence in the city made me wonder if I'd see Noah's name mentioned or his photograph displayed as either a victim or a suspect. I realized with growing clarity how little I actually knew about the man I'd considered my closest friend, his real activities during our months of limited contact, his associates and business partners, his sources of income, even whether the terror in his eyes had been genuine fear or simply another form of manipulation designed to ensure my cooperation. The loyal part of me that remembered our teenage friendship and shared history hoped he was safe somewhere, perhaps starting over in a new city with whatever resources that backpack had contained, building a legitimate life away from whatever criminal elements had forced him into hiding. But a growing cynical voice in my head suggested I'd been nothing more than a convenient solution to a temporary problem, someone with a clean record and stable living situation who could be trusted to provide shelter without asking too many questions or demanding too many answers. The more time passed without any communication from him, the more I suspected that our entire friendship might have been less genuine than I'd believed, that I'd been cultivated over the years as a resource to be deployed when needed, rather than valued as a person worthy of honesty and respect. Noah's Hats again has been returning to my apartment, messing with my bicycle, and turning lights off and on willy-nilly, and now I have seen him outside my window. My friends have moved, and I shall too. But this time, I will be more prepared.
Looking back now, several months after Noah's mysterious departure, I can see with uncomfortable clarity how completely he had controlled every aspect of our situation, from that first desperate phone call to his calculated disappearance. He'd known exactly which emotional buttons to push to get me to risk everything for him. Our shared history and deep friendship, his apparent vulnerability and genuine terror, the suggestion that I was his only hope for survival in a situation that threatened his life. The bloody backpack, the paranoid behavior, the fragmented explanations that revealed nothing substantial about our actual circumstances. It all could have been carefully orchestrated theater designed to keep me compliant and unquestioning while he used my apartment as a safe house and planning headquarters for whatever his real agenda might have been. I still don't know if the danger he described was real or manufactured specifically to manipulate my protective instincts, if those mysterious enemies actually existed, or if Noah simply needed time and a secure location to plan his exit strategy from whatever criminal activities he'd become involved with during our period of estrangement. What I do know with certainty is that I haven't heard from him since that morning when I woke up to find him gone, and part of me genuinely hopes I never do, because any future contact would likely mean he needs something else from me rather than simply wanting to rebuild our friendship. The Noah who called me from that rail yard and spent a week hiding in my apartment was a stranger wearing the face of someone I'd trusted completely.
and I'm not sure I could survive another encounter with that version of him. The hardest part of processing this entire experience isn't the lingering paranoia that makes me check my locks twice before bed, or the damage to my work attendance record and personal relationships from that week of enforced isolation, or even the financial strain of supporting 2 people on my warehouse salary while maintaining the fiction that everything in my life was normal. The hardest part is the fundamental realization that someone I trusted completely was capable of weaponizing that trust against me, using our friendship as a tool to get what he needed without regard for the risks he was forcing me to assume or the psychological damage his deception would cause. Every genuine moment of our shared history now feels potentially suspect. Every memory contaminated by the possibility that I was always just a resource in his back pocket, someone to be deployed when conventional options were exhausted. I've had to accept that the Noah I thought I knew, the loyal friend who'd stood by me through teenage heartbreak and family problems, who'd shared dreams and secrets and plans for the future, may never have existed at all, or at least not in the way I'd understood and valued those experiences. The frightened, desperate man who showed up at my door carrying a blood-stained backpack might have been the first glimpse of who he really was underneath the carefully maintained facade of friendship and shared history. The rail yard where I found him has been demolished now, replaced by a shopping center and business park. But sometimes I drive by that area just to remind myself that some chapters of our lives are meant to stay closed forever, that some people are better left in the past where they can't hurt us again.